The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History Magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History Magazine. On this episode, we look back at a ghostly article written in 2020 by John Irwin. Today, let's take a look at the article, Oreapolis, Nebraska's Ghost City. The dream was of a great city in Nebraska, the future gateway to the entire American West. It would be the largest, most important urban center between Chicago and San Francisco, a bustling metropolis of commerce, but also a cultural hub crowned by a distinguished university marking the high aspirations of its enterprising and educated citizens. Geography mattered. Just as heretofore with Pittsburgh and St. Louis, the city's strategic location at the junction of two key historic transportation routes, the Missouri and Platte Rivers, would inevitably ensure its quick growth and prosperity. In 1857, amidst a frenzy of Western railroad schemes, Dr. John Evans, the ambitious Chicago real estate tycoon, believed he had the vision and experience for the success of this audacious undertaking. For in his busy life, he had already founded both a city and a university. This new metropolis would be the most significant achievement of his life, the fulfillment of his destiny. Or so he thought. He did not know then that his acquaintance with Abraham Lincoln would play a crucial part in the fate of his new enterprise and the future course of his own life in the American West. Born in 1814 in a log cabin near Waynesville, Ohio, John Evans was the first of 11 children in a Quaker family. As a young adult, he had ambitions far beyond his provincial rural storekeeper's life, and he fought with his father to allow him to attend medical school at Cincinnati College, where he graduated in 1838. In 1840, he met Reverend Matthew Simpson, president of the Methodist Asbury College, later DuPont University, whose eloquent speaking had a magnetic, far-reaching influence on his future life and career. Dissatisfied with his constricted Quaker upbringing, Evans eagerly converted to Methodism. His connection with Simpson, who later became a prominent Methodist bishop influential in national politics, sparked his deep interest in education. As a physician in a small Indiana town, Evans championed building a home and a school for deaf mutes and provided state care for the mentally ill. As its first superintendent, in 1846, Evans constructed the Indiana Hospital for the Insane, which was a progressive model for its time. In 1848, when he was 34, Evans moved to Chicago, the young, bustling city of 25,000, to teach at the Rush Medical College, where he promoted public health and excelled in research, publishing, and inventing medical devices. He helped establish Chicago's first hospital and the Chicago Medical Society. During this time, Evans also began speculating in real estate, building construction, and railroads. He quickly established himself as a powerful business and political leader at the forefront of Chicago's growth into the largest metropolis in the Midwest. He also became wealthy and ended his medical practice to concentrate on his business pursuits. As a civic leader on the board of aldermen, he championed public sanitation, public schools, and other improvements to help regulate the city's undisciplined growth. Evans was a model for the new self-made Protestant capitalist, sober, stodgy, moralistic, but also energetic, hardworking, shrewd, risk-taking, and ruthless when required. Uninterested in the decadent excesses of typical oligarch capitalist, he ascribed to the notion that the accumulation of wealth carried the responsibility of promoting social betterment, and his life embodied this self-descriptive phase, industry and usefulness. Evans projected respectability throughout his understated modesty and philanthropic commitments, especially his keen interest in education that he stated was, quote, the only sure ground for the improvement of our social and political condition, end quote. However, Later historians have viewed his underlying smug piety in a different light, such as the recent Northwestern University research project examining his role in the notorious Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado. Quote, convinced of the importance of doing right, John Evans seemed to have maintained the self-satisfied view that something was right because he had done it, end quote. Under Bishop Simpson's influence, Evans joined with other Chicago businessmen to charter a Methodist institution, the Northwestern, later Northwestern University, in 1850, where he served as president of its board of trustees. Classes began in 1855 in Evanston, the new city named after him north of Chicago on Lake Michigan. At the same time, under Evans' promotion, Reverend John Dempster opened the affiliated Garrett Biblical Institute, now Garrett Evangelical Seminary, in Evanston for training Methodist clergy. John Evans was on a roll. In spite of the economic ups and downs of the 1850s, he seemed to ultimately have success with everything he touched. Evans next set his eyes on Nebraska for even grander opportunities. Historian Merrill Mattis aptly described the historic transportation route across Nebraska as the Great Platte River Road. For Odo, Omaha, and Pawnee natives, and for 18th and early 19th century French and Spanish explorers and fur traders, the Missouri and Platte Rivers were widely recognized as a key route onto the interior of the North American continent. The expeditions to Rocky Mountains of Stephen H. Long in 1820 and John C. Fremont of 1842 and the popular Oregon Trail cemented the primary importance of the Platte River for westward migration. Steamboats on the Missouri River, growing steadily in number from the 1840s, enhanced this route. After the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, many northern Missouri River towns sprang up, such as Rouleau, Brownville, Nebraska City, Plattsmouth, Omaha, Canesville, also known as Council Bluffs, Iowa, DeSoto, Decatur, and Sioux City, Iowa. Spurred by the California Gold Rush, wagon freighting companies in the 1850s moved large quantities of supplies from Missouri River towns west to military forts and overland trail stations. They also supplied the ever-increasing mass emigration through the Platte River Valley to Utah, California, and Oregon. An estimated 500,000 travelers headed west between 1841 and 1866, with 80,000 alone crossing Nebraska in 1859. After Mexico ceded vast western lands to the United States in the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe-Hidalgo, the proposal for a Pacific Railroad route became a national controversy that was only a little less hotly contested than the issue of slavery expanding into western territories by the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act. All recognized it would be a monumental importance to the future growth and economy of the expanding nation. However, many thought there would only ever be one transcontinental Western Railroad. Thus, the spoils destined for the victor of the eastern terminus, guaranteeing vast riches along into the future, only increased the intense rivalry between cities, states, and regions. In the mid-1850s, the outcome was not predetermined or inevitable. Many factors would influence the future site chosen for the western terminus. As a cover to this political dilemma, Congress authorized the Corps of Topographical Engineers to conduct 8 hasty surveys between 1853 and 1855 to examine pet routes of congressmen. This resulted in 13 mammoth volumes of the Pacific Railroad reports, containing unparalleled, valuable scientific data of the West. The irony, though, was that most obvious Platte Valley route through Nebraska was ignored. To the consternation of Northern Congressmen, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis favored the most southern 32nd parallel route passing through Texas and New Mexico, which would most benefit southern cities. So, instead of resolving the question, these reports only fueled this unsolved national political dilemma for the location of the ultimate pork barrel patronage prize. Repeated attempts at legislation to choose the route left this fractious question of the eastern terminus still unresolved at the eve of the Civil War. Railroad fever also remained at a high pitch in Nebraska. In January of 1855, Acting Governor Thomas Cummings' opening address at the first territorial legislature in Omaha stressed the importance of building a Pacific Railroad across Nebraska. two competing bills were passed: the Missouri River and Platte Valley Railroad from Plattsmouth to South Pass, and the Platte River and Pacific Railroad Company from Douglas County, Omaha, Bellevue, and Florence, along the north side of the Platte River to the western boundary of the territory. Both were accompanied by a joint memorial resolution to the U.S. Congress requesting a land grant. In the second territorial session, Governor Izard also emphasized the importance of the railroad to Nebraska's future, but the Nebraska City, Saline City, future site of Lincoln, and Fort Kearny Railroad Incorporation bill died in committee for unknown reasons. However, in 1857, the territorial legislature incorporated yet another line, the Nebraska Central Railroad Company, that would connect Burt County, Decatur, to Laramie, with a branch to Fort Kearny. This was to be an extension of the proposed Iowa Central Air Line Railroad, originating in Chicago and crossing the Missouri River between Ottawa, Iowa, and Decatur. The same year, a bill passed for the Central Pacific Railroad to run north of the Omaha Indian Reservation in Dakota County. It was to link Sioux City to Washington Territory and the Pacific. In 1858, two additional incorporation bills passed: the Missouri River and Nemaha Valley Railroad from Nebraska City to Fort Kearny, while a Decatur-Columbus Railroad bill called for a route via the Platte River to California. None of these pre-Civil War railroads were constructed, but they demonstrated the keen aspirations of many Missouri River towns to be the eastern terminus of the Pacific Railroad. Of more immediate need was the development of roads to improve communication and travel for military purposes and for immigrants flocking to California, Oregon, and Utah. Following Secretary of War Jefferson Davis's recommendation, Congress also authorized extensive road building projects throughout the West, including improvements of the Platte River Road. In 1856, Lieutenant Jonathan H. Dickerson began a survey from Omaha west along the Mormon Immigrant Trail along the north side of the Platte River. The following year, Captain Beckwith constructed small bridges on the road, but it remained impassable in spring months and much work remained, while requests to Congress of $100,000 for more improvements were ignored. At the same time, Lieutenant Governor K. Warren, a Corps of Topographical Engineers surveying northern routes, also recommended the Omaha Mormon Trail route as far superior to any route west. From crafty politicians to profiteer speculators to hundreds of thousands of humble rural poor, many Americans were lured by the bonanza of the untold wealth they believed could be theirs in the westward expansion. In 1857, from his Chicago office at 55 Clark Street, John Evans was poised to act. He surmised that the junction of the Platte and Missouri rivers was already the prime transportation route to the west. Logically, he pinpointed this site, until recently the location of a large Oto village, as a tremendous investment opportunity that lay ripe for the plucking, and he organized the Oreapolis Town Company on October 30th, 1857. Strikingly, Evans made these bold expansionist plans immediately following the onset of the severe financial panic of 1857, the first worldwide economic crisis that had begun in September. In the United States, the bubble of inflated railroad stocks collapsed, and loans for development suddenly dried up. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, and in the West especially, land speculation and growth ground to a quick halt. Frontier territorial Nebraska, in its economic infancy, was devastated with debt, hounding creditors, worthless local bank-issued currency and notes, tax delinquencies, and mass land foreclosures. John Evans was looking to the future as he made his move in Nebraska. With the contrarian prescience of a clever financier, he knew that the fortune was to be made by buying and expanding while prices were low and most investors were retreating through financial fear. Rather than the usual order of events in which a small frontier settlement grows organically from its hinterland into the regional commercial center, Evans would jumpstart the process by creating a planned large city and university from its inception. This instant city would be the future Pacific Railroad terminus to which tens of thousands of immigrants would naturally flock. Believing that if he built it, they would come, Evans was confident that he had the foresight, influence, and pluck to make this bold idea a success. He assembled 16 investors from Chicago, New York, and Iowa to back his plan, including Iowan Thomas Hart Benton Jr., nephew of the famous Missouri senator of the same name. Evans grandly named his new city Oreapolis, supposedly derived from the Greek for border city, and envisioned a major university as its focus. The following year, his plan was greatly enhanced by the cataclysmic announcement of the discovery of gold in Colorado in September of 1858. John Evans must have been giddy as he surmised that Oreapolis could also be the gateway for the inevitable stampede to the Colorado goldfields. As if Evans had planned the 1859 Pikes Peak Gold Rush himself, he was right on the mark as he filed the Oreapolis Town Company Articles of Incorporation on September 29, 1858 in Cass County. In October, lot surveys and plat maps were completed for 2 sections of land at the junction of the Platte and Missouri Rivers, and in Omaha, both the Oreapolis University and Seminary proposals breezed through the territorial legislature and were charted on October 23, 1858. However, the Dempster Biblical Seminary hit a roadblock when a legislative committee defeated the charter bill by a vote of 6-4 over the controversial issue of exempting the religious property from taxation. In Omaha, Evans had his first encounter with local politics affected by national events. His new foe, J. Sterling Morton, was quoted about the Oreapolis venture, quote, "Thank God, the legislature is Democratic, and I'd like to see that damned Methodist abolition hole get any legislation this winter," end quote. In the same article, the Dempster Biblical Institute also came under attack. The seminary, quote, "was defeated in the legislature, to our personal knowledge, because it was to favor the Methodists, who, it was said, were generally opposed to modern Buchanan democracy. This, we know, was given as reason by Democrats of opposing the passage of the bill," end quote. Advertised to Iowans and Methodists throughout the nation, the first settlers arrived at the Oreapolis site to purchase lots and began building during the fall and winter of 1858. Visiting Oreapolis in April 1859, Evans confidently wrote to his wife Margaret in Evanston that Oreapolis was, quote, "well established and well advertised," end quote. There was a ferry across the Missouri River, 50 houses on the town site, and a hotel, bank, and lumber and brick yards were under construction. He predicted by the end of the year there would be 100 homes, and the following year 1,000 inhabitants. He also surveyed a road to Cass County's western boundary, and his optimism continued in a June letter to his wife, quote, "I shall make a road that will be a great thoroughfare to the gold regions, Salt Lake, Oregon, and California. And when the road is once opened, it will make Oreapolis the great starting point for the overland routes to those points." As to the prospects of Oreapolis, they continue to be very good indeed. It will make a great city, and there can be no mistake. If we succeed, it will be a great and glorious success. 3 grand institutions founded for the good of the church and of mankind, end quote. In Chicago, the Press and Tribune opined about Oreapolis' future in a glowing editorial. They wrote, "But there are so many places in the country where business is at a standstill, and the emigration to Nebraska and the gold fields has awakened such life and trade on the Missouri River that we have no doubt of its growth into a prominent commercial city. By reference to the map of the United States, we find that the city of Chicago, the mouth of the Platte River, Fort Kearny, where all of the routes to gold regions meet, and the mouth of Cherry Creek, the center of the mines, are in exactly the same parallel of latitude. Besides, the Missouri River Railroad that terminates at this new town is completed about 50 miles nearer to the Missouri than any other railroad. Those having goods on hand which they desire to convert into cash rapidly, and persons wishing to build upon a business in trade or manufacturers at a point where they can enjoy a part of the benefits of the growth of the city, would do well to call upon Dr. Evans, who is so well known in this community as a safe and reliable businessman that commendation from us is entirely unnecessary. His reputation will secure the implicit confidence of the public." Published in September 1859, the cover title of John Evans' 15-page prospectus, Oreapolis, Nebraska Territory, its institutions, advantages, bore a salient phrase, quote, "The early settlers make the money," end quote. This rare publication is perhaps the most extensive promotional document now existing from Nebraska's territorial period. In it, Evans boasted that Oreapolis, quote, "is believed to be the point on the Missouri River from which the most eligible route for a railroad extends up the Platte Valley via the Great Salt Springs, the present site of Lincoln, and Fort Kearny to the new gold mines, Salt Lake, and California," end quote. He exhorted the virtues of the 1,500 acres of hills, valleys, and plains. It had the best wagon road west, a steam ferry across the Missouri, excellent water in springs and wells, a vein of coal nearby, and clay, lime, and sand for brickmaking. The hills were well timbered for fuel and building material, and there was cheap land extending for 100 miles west that offered one of the most fertile and beautiful prairie countries in the world. In addition to financial inducements to attract a variety of retail businesses, Evans planned for Oreapolis to be a major manufacturing center. His prospectus offered bonuses for the establishment of a pork packing house, a flour mill, a foundry and machine shop, fanning mills and factories for wagon, plow, and agricultural implements, coopering, tannery, cabinet and chairs, saddle and harness, gunsmithing, watch and clocks, woodcut, seal and stencils, hat and cap, and soap and candles. He stressed that, quote, "the inhabitants of the place from all parts of the country are of an active, industrious, enterprising, and energetic class, forming a good society, such as few places in a new country can enjoy," end quote. The most important of all, he assured readers, quote, "that no one who will take an unbiased view of the plan of the Oreapolis Company can fail to see in it the elements of a very speedy success. In fact, with the advantages of the site and the unprecedented array of inducements to settlers and other influences secured in its favor, no one will entertain a doubt of the rapid growth and ultimate importance of Oreapolis." Evans was not exaggerating about the large-scale design of his new city. The updated survey plat still in the Cass County's engineer department reveals plans for an extended city with 276 blocks and thousands of lots. East-west streets were named, including Broadway, Main, Evans, and Dempster streets, and north-south streets extended 18 numbered blocks west from the Missouri. The plat included elevated hill land designated for its three core educational institutions: the university, the high school seminary, and the theological seminary. There was also land set aside for a large city park, 4 public schools, the town hall, a railroad depot, and a railroad right-of-way through the north section of the city. The capital stock of the town company was $35,000 divided into 100 shares of $350 each. The prospectus reported that the imposing 80 by 34-foot, 3-story brick seminary building to accommodate 250 students, larger than the new Second Territorial Capitol building in Omaha, was under construction, and the theological seminary would begin instruction in the autumn of 1860. A proposed college or university was a bragging point for numerous raw settlements of this era. Boosters in nearby Omaha incorporated Simpson University, named after Evans' mentor Bishop Simpson, in March of 1855 as a promotional scheme when it was but a village of 300 inhabitants. 2 local sponsors donated 75 acres, and supporters sent an unheeded request to the U.S. Congress for 15,000 acres to support the school. The following year, the university was reincorporated under the control of the Methodist Church, which stipulated its enrollment would be non-denominational and open to women, an emerging progressive notion in the Midwest. In addition to arts and sciences, it was to have departments of law, medicine, agriculture, and theology. However, as each year passed, a proposed building was not constructed, and the school never opened, even though in the summer of 1859 it was announced classes would begin in November. In April of 1859, John Evans won a major initial victory over Omaha and the Kansas-Nebraska Methodist Conference. After 4 years of inaction, Methodists withdrew their support from Omaha's unopened Simpson University in favor of Evans' new university in Oreapolis, while also endorsing its seminary and Biblical Institute. A letter from Mr. Dempster, president of the Biblical Institute at Northwestern University, informed the body that he would open the Dempster Biblical Institute in Oreapolis if, as he believed, 10 students showed interest, and it was reported that he had raised $30,000 or $40,000. Evans' influence and connections were paying off. At the same meeting, Evans also vanquished the rival proposal from Greg's Spot, a settlement adjacent to Nebraska City for Olin University. The Nebraska City News was infuriated. With sour grapes, it sullied the Platte River as, quote, one of the most uncertain, unfathomable, uncrossable, unbridgeable, unwalkable rivers in the Western world, end quote. And it ridiculed Oreapolis by printing, already extensive advertisements are given out throughout the country, locating divine bankers, reverend exchange brokers, buyers of real estate, and sellers of the same on the corners of as many different streets nearly as New York or Boston can boast of. And all this upon a town site, upon which there is not a single house, shanty, pig pen, or chicken coop erected. The following year, in 1860, the Methodist Conference appointed Reverend William H. Good as agent to Oreapolis and further refined its relationship with the proposed institutions by conservatively scaling back Evans' plan. With a dearth of quality schools in Nebraska, the seminary would be the first step. The future university endowment, exemption from taxation, was not to be accessed for 10 years. The founders and the several board of trustees have acted with reference to what they conceive to be the real, present, and prospective wants of the Nebraska territory and the adjacent country. They confidently believe that a seminary of the grade contemplated will fully meet all actual demands of the present, and they desire the property donated as a university fund to lie unused until its value shall have become such as effectively to secure the intended and ultimate object. It is the purpose of the several board members to move with energy, but with caution, and positively to avoid all embarrassing indebtedness. If Evans had thought that his city would fill a void in the wilderness and the Pacific Railroad terminus at Oreapolis would be a foregone conclusion, as soon realized that parallel opposing forces in Nebraska were moving swiftly on the ground. The existing Missouri River towns were rapidly growing and exerting their economic and political influence. These rivals vied for the same ultimate railroad prize and stood as formidable barriers blocking Evans' plan. Kansas City and St. Joseph were contenders to the south, and Decatur, DeSoto, and Sioux City to the north also had serious aspirations. More immediate challengers were nearby, Bellevue, Florence, and Brownville, but three bustling river towns were the most serious roadblocks to Oreapolis' intended destiny. Nebraska City, a spectacular town on the site of old Fort Kearny, had developed into a major government supply center with more than 60 freighters. It boomed beyond all expectations when the large and influential Russell, Majors, and Waddell Freight Company moved their headquarters there from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in 1858. This combined and most direct overland route to the new Fort Kearny in central Nebraska with the closest railhead at St. Joseph, Missouri, only a 2-day steamboat trip south. From the docking of 212 steamboats in 1859, 1,100 men in 700 wagons transported 12.7 million pounds of goods to Utah and western forts and supply stations. In 1860, Nebraska City had population comparable to Omaha and was its main competitor. Only a few miles south of Oreapolis was the well-established village of Plattsmouth. Since 1848, it was an important ferry crossing for Mormons and later Western immigrants before it became a settlement in 1854. The ferry was upgraded to steam in 1857, and 2,472 wagons crossed the Missouri River at Plattsmouth, headed west in the spring of 1859. Thus, unlike Oreapolis, it became a significant debarkation and supply point for the Colorado Gold Rush. Plattsmouth won the seat of government for Cass County in 1855 as one of Nebraska's original counties, but lost the Nebraska Territorial Capital Prize by a single vote in the ferocious 1855 legislative battle. Far surpassing nearby Oreapolis, its thriving businesses included a newspaper, bank, 2 law and land offices, 2 physicians, 3 general stores, 3 hotels, ice and express companies, drug and jewelry stores, a blacksmith shop, brickyard, lumber and grist mills, along with an outfitter store for immigrants. A stage line connected it directly with the Burlington and Missouri Railhead at Ottumwa, Iowa, and it too solicited vociferously for the Pacific Railroad terminus. In 1856, the town had chartered the Plattsmouth Preparatory and Collegiate Institute, a paper school that, like so many others, never opened. By 1860, it had a population of 474, more than double that of nearby Oreapolis. Only a few issues of the Plattsmouth newspaper exist from this time, but one can surmise that its residents would not have welcomed on their doorstep the interloper town scheme backed by a big Chicago money, which challenged Plattsmouth's very existence. It was Omaha, though, that eventually assumed dominance over all the northern Missouri River towns through its many advantages. The area had long been a focal point as a transportation route and early settlement. In their exodus to Utah after expulsion from Nauvoo, Illinois, Mormons followed the north side of the Platte River to Fort Kearny. In 1846, they established temporary headquarters at Winter Quarters, later renamed Florence, now an Omaha neighborhood, on the Nebraska side of the Missouri River. Canesville, their later headquarters on the Iowa side, renamed Council Bluffs in 1853, was the terminus of a trail across Iowa. It was an important embarkation point west for many immigrants, with a busy steam ferry crossing the river and an increasing number of steamboats. Council Bluffs boosters officially founded Omaha on the opposite bank of the Missouri River at a picnic on July 4, 1854, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act had passed on May 30th. And just days after President Pierce signed a controversial ratification treaty with the Oto-Missourias and Omaha tribes ceding their Nebraska lands. In September, speculators revealed their grand urban vision of Omaha City with a new plat map featuring 320 blocks. Thomas Cumming, an Iowa Democratic politician and acting Nebraska territorial governor after the untimely death of Governor Burt, was connected with the Council Bluffs and Nebraska Ferry Company speculators. Instead of Bellevue, the presumed capital to be at the hamlet that had grown around Peter Sarpy's trading post and Indian mission, Cumming craftily convened the first territorial legislature in Omaha on January 15, 1855. He also corruptly apportioned the newly created counties north of the Platte River with more representatives, even though their population was half that south of the Platte. The first legislature met in Omaha in an unfinished, hastily constructed small brick building supplied by the ferry company. It was surrounded by 20 crude log cabins and shacks with dirt floors housing a few businesses, saloons, hotels, and homes. Residency was nebulous. Many of Nebraska's first legislators from various counties along the Missouri River actually resided in Iowa, and in Omaha, some crossed the river each day from Council Bluffs to attend the legislative session. Omaha was a scrappy town, yet its initial political advantage was almost its undoing in its ongoing ferocious, hyper-partisan conflict with the South Platte faction. The contentious battle to move the capital from Omaha was the main focus of the territorial legislature in its first 4 years. This climaxed in January 1858 with a fistfight brawl followed by a splinter group of disgruntled legislators caucusing in a rump session in Florence. They voted to remove the capital, but Governor William Richardson voided the act. Many times, it seemed that the capital would be relocated to Bellevue, Plattsmouth, Fontenelle, or to paper towns south of the Platte such as Chester, Douglas, or Neapolis. A serious attempt by South Platters in 1858 and 59 for Kansas to annex Nebraska lands south of the Platte River also went nowhere, as Omaha was always able to duck the wrath of its bitter detractors. Through good luck and wily political maneuverings, Omaha's supporters managed to retain the capital until statehood in 1867. In its first 5 years, Nebraska was dominated by Democrats and preoccupied with local matters. But by 1859, local political parties were linked with the political issues of the looming Civil War. Two factions split the Democratic Party in the territory: those who were pro-Southern and pro-slavery sympathies of President Buchanan, and those who supported Senator Stephen Douglas and popular sovereignty. Nebraskans complained of corrupt and incompetent appointed Democratic territorial officials and of federal land sales favoring mercenary speculators and predatory land sharks instead of offering inexpensive land to homesteaders. In the momentous 1860 election, a national Republican administration swept into office, and for the first time, the party also gained control of the Nebraska territorial legislature. It was into this vortex of political turbulence that, perhaps naively, Republican John Evans inserted himself and his entrepreneurial dream of Oreapolis. The June 1860 U.S. Census recorded that construction was the economic base of fledgling Oreapolis, with many working on the seminary building. There were 8 carpenters, 7 masons, 2 plasterers, an engineer, and a surveyor. The professional class included 1 physician and the professor principal, Reverend George Loomis, of the yet-to-open seminary. This modest number of occupations was rounded out by 3 merchants, a hotel keeper, a tailor, baker, gunsmith, blacksmith, 8 laborers, a public school teacher, and 14 area farmers. Most of the residents were from Northeast and Upper Midwest states, with a scattering from Northern Europe, England, and Ireland. In all, there are 187 residents. The seminary trustees had raised $13,000 by the time of their organizational meeting on June 1st of 1859. On June 28th, they awarded a contract to Loudon Mullen, a businessman and speculator from Council Bluffs and Glenwood, Iowa, to erect the seminary building designed by an Iowa City architect. Built on the side of a hill on a commanding site and planned upon an opposing model with an approved style of architecture, its brick exterior and roof were finished December 1st, 1859. Although the project was not in debt, the construction was not completed until September of 1861 due to a lack of $5,000. The inaugural lecture was presented free to the public in Academy Hall on the evening of December 23, 1861, by Reverend L.D. Hughes of Pacific City, Iowa. Reverend A.G. White, described as the most, quote, aggressive and thorough of men, end quote, was appointed principal of the seminary in 1862. But the following year, like his Nebraska City contemporary, Reverend John Shivington, he became a fighting parson, commander in the Plains Indian Wars. Hughes was replaced by Reverend J.G. Miller from Genesee, New York, previously the school's agent. Noted as a shrewd business manager with a forceful personality, Miller became preoccupied with various business enterprises and landed investments which required so much of his attention that as a rule his ministerial function became mainly a coordinate branch of his life's activity. He was best known for his aggressive advocacy of temperance and his relentless warfare on the rummies, as he called the saloon keepers and their supporters. Later, he ran as a temperance candidate, and his fiery speeches attracted large audiences. Public education in early territorial Nebraska was primitive and meager, with less than 1/3 of children attending school in 1860. Minimally qualified teachers only needed to pass a simple examination, described at the time as a farce, and most districts spent only a little more than $100 per year, primarily on salaries for schools offering only the basics of a primary ungraded education. Most of these were rural township schools with brief terms of sometimes only a few months taught in log buildings or homes. Cass County fared better, with 2/3 of its school-age children, 569 students, enrolled in 26 public schools in 1860, an average of 21 students per school. Plattsmouth had only 4 teachers for 214 students in 2 small buildings, and it did not have graded schools until 1872. Cass County's first public high school in Rock Bluff did not open until 1870. To fill the education gap in Nebraska, there were only smatterings of intermittent private schools, usually sponsored by churches, with 1 or only a few teachers. In Omaha, a public school that opened in 1860 was soon closed due to the Civil War and did not resume until 1863, when Omaha's first public school construction was a single one-room frame structure that was already inadequate when it opened. A high school for students of all ages, which charged tuition for higher classes, was conducted 1864 to 1867 in the cramped original 1854 Capitol building. Some concerned Omaha parents sent their children to boarding school in St. Louis. Omaha's first public high school building finally opened in 1872 on the site of the demolished Second Capitol that was donated by the state legislature. The high school shared the building with primary grades and did not graduate its first class of 11 until 1876. In sharp contrast, on the bluff overlooking the Missouri River, the new Oreapolis Seminary opened in the largest school building in Nebraska. It was a bold commitment to education that offered local parents a considerably better opportunity for their children than most places in Nebraska, with educated teachers and a full college preparatory curriculum in a spacious new brick building. In March 1862, the Methodist Conference noted its approval that the seminary had held 2 11-week sessions with 50 students enrolled. The 1860 Oreapolis Census Enumeration District listed 29 high school-age students, and perhaps some Plattsmouth students also made the daily 8-mile round-trip journey. Possibly, the seminary also attracted boarding students from other Nebraska counties and western Iowa. Nevertheless, the private institution church-sponsored school in the extreme northeast corner of the county with poor roads would have had difficulty recruiting students from the more populous areas of Omaha or Nebraska City. On a return trip to Oreapolis in October 1859, Evans saw the expected boom was not materializing. Money was scarce, and privately at least he began to doubt the economic wisdom of his venture. He wrote to his wife Margaret, quote, "It makes me sick to think of the failure in our enterprise, and yet it may come upon us. I have hope in the future, although the present looks dark enough to give me the blues terribly," end quote. Back in Chicago, he threw himself into promotion. Before the Chicago Board of Trade, he expressed the urgent need to establish a direct express line of wagons and coaches between Chicago and the Colorado goldfields. He noted a road through Iowa and Nebraska was, quote, "the best and most natural and most direct route," end quote, to transport goods, gold, and passengers. Pointing out the mounting concern that Chicago was losing out on the economic windfall to St. Louis in outfitting Western immigrants, he called for the city to create an office for the incoming gold from Colorado. Evans was also frustrated that the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad construction was stalled in eastern Iowa. Thus, in the spring of 1860, he joined the Chicago Board of Trade in advocating for the Cedar Rapids and Missouri River Railroad to speed their rail building as soon as possible to Nebraska and the Platte Valley as a route to Colorado. The Press and Tribune urged its readers not to take sides over competing railroads across Iowa, arguing that Chicago should have 2 railroads to the Missouri River. Hedging his bets, in March of 1860, Evans also became one of the national commissioners of the People's Pacific Railroad Company, newly incorporated in Maine, that called for an inexact terminus somewhere, quote, "between the mouth of the Platte River to the north and the Kansas River on the south," end quote, and which would pass through Utah and San Francisco. In 1860, John Evans earnestly tried every means to establish a transportation link to the junction of the Missouri and the Platte Rivers and his city. Oreapolis was seriously faltering in spite of its considerable educational advantage, even as Omaha, Nebraska City, and nearby Plattsmouth flourished with the increasing commerce of overland immigrants and freighting. The expected 500 German immigrants never arrived, and the university and theological school plans evaporated. In a final desperate push to jumpstart his enterprise, Evans persuaded the Nebraska Territorial Legislature to recharter the university at Oreapolis on January 10, 1861. The following day, the legislature passed incorporation bills for the Plattsmouth, Fort Kearny, and Denver City Railroad and the Chicago, Plattsmouth, and Pikes Peak Express Company that Evans had urged in Chicago the previous year. It is revealing that Plattsmouth was designated as the proposed railroad terminus, signifying that Oreapolis's fortunes were quickly fading. Perhaps as a last resort to save his investment and dream, John Evans sought the governorship of Nebraska Territory. He could parlay his association with President Lincoln to select Oreapolis as the east terminus of the Pacific Railroad. Even if Oreapolis might be a lost cause for this all-important designation, as governor, he would be placed at the center of Western Railroad building and entrepreneurial development, both key in achieving Nebraska's statehood and his own economic interest. Since the impressive seminary building was already under construction, might his city be repurposed yet as a university suburb to Omaha, as Evanston was to Chicago? Abraham Lincoln owed political debts to Northern Methodists for their crucial support in the 1860 election campaign, and Bishop Simpson and his allies exerted their considerable influence upon him to appoint Evans. He was both an acquaintance of Lincoln and, as a delegate of the 1860 Illinois Republican Convention, a strong supporter opposed to slavery. Recognizing his important business and political connections to Nebraska, future Governor Robert Furniss gushed over Evans' candidacy in Brandville's Nebraska Advertiser. It wrote, quote, "We admit the fact that Dr. Evans has invested largely in Nebraska and is able and anxious to see her material resources developed, and that he has chosen his points sagaciously and hopefully. The enterprising hail him a true and valuable cooperator. Those who have made his acquaintance all over the territory bear united testimony in his energy, firmness of character, and whole-souled politeness, and there can be no question but his administration would be an entire success at home and honorably known by his extended influence abroad. We need and must have a man at the head of affairs who can call the attention of prudent enterprise and capital to the wants and movements of Nebraska. From some knowledge of men and their motives, we have no hesitancy in declaring that the appointment of Dr. Evans would be the first instance very acceptable to the masses of the people, afterwards ardently esteemed, and finally an object of gratitude to the President for the wisdom of the act." End quote. On December 28, 1860, 20 Republican legislatures in both the Nebraska Council and House of Representatives signed a letter to newly elected President Lincoln urging Evans' appointment. The behind-the-scenes politics involving the fate of this letter remains murky after 160 years. In retrospect, Evans remembered that, quote, "We fixed up a plan while we were in Omaha. I had a good many friends there, that when Lincoln was inaugurated, I should be appointed governor of Nebraska, and the members of both houses of the legislature, the winter before the inauguration, sent a recommendation to that fact. It was the very strong document, but it never reached Mr. Lincoln because I understood afterwards that somebody captured it on the way. At any rate, I went on, supposing that the recommendation had been received all right, and I was presented by Senator Harlan. I found the recommendation had not been received. Harlan said that he could not recommend me for that place, but that I should be appointed governor of some other territory. But he had already promised another man to do what he could for him on the Nebraska question." End quote. With heavy lobbying from Senator Charles Sumner and other powerful Republican politicians, Lincoln instead appointed this position to Alvin Saunders, an outspoken anti-slavery advocate from Mount Pleasant, Iowa, who had been an invaluable supporter in Lincoln's campaign. The fatal blow to the fledgling Oreapolis community was President Lincoln's appointment of John Evans to be the new governor of Colorado Territory in March of 1862 as a result of Bishop Simpson's intense lobbying on his behalf. Evans' influence and wealth would now be directed to Denver instead of Oreapolis, and he apparently suffered a serious financial setback from his Oreapolis venture. Many Oreapolis residents and investors no doubt blamed the absent Evans for abandoning them and for their economic losses. In July 1862, Evans, now in Denver, received a letter from a Plattsmouth man representing a local group advocating for the Pacific Railroad terminus south of the Platte River. They were incredulous to learn that Evans now favored Omaha as the eastern terminus and demanded to hear his denial. Evans was an opportunist and had moved on when he was appointed to the Board of Commissioners of the Union Pacific Railroad, clearly seeing that Council Bluffs in Omaha would be chosen. In his departure for Colorado, he left behind rancorous feelings of betrayal in Cass County. Oreapolis' collapse was sudden. The seminary probably closed shortly after the March 1864 meeting in Omaha when the Methodist Conference rescinded its support because the property had not been deeded to their trustees. The closing of the Oreapolis post office in October of 1864 marked the upstart town's final death knell. The bubble burst, as boom bubbles do, with finality that was appalling. Suddenly, the realization spread that Oreapolis would be many years in obtaining prosperity, and, if at all, almost overnight it became a deserted village. The paper millionaires awoke to find that all hope must be abandoned, and that their high-priced town lots had become again nothing but raw prairie land, worthless, without a backing of capital. Like the children that danced to the Pied Piper's tune, the motley population streamed northward in the wake of the specter speculation. Oreapolis' rapid decline can be readily traced in Cass County records. Loudon Mullen, the principal investor, purchased 30 lots from the Oreapolis Town Company of May of 1860 at an average price of $66. 2 years later, in May of 1862, he unloaded 34 lots and adjacent land holdings at the fire sale price of $35 per lot. Many others were selling lots in 1863 and 64 at a loss of half or more of the purchase price. Cass County's land assessment and tax records also mirror the slump. At the initial platting of Oreapolis in 1857, lots were appraised at $7. By 1861, several of John Evans' lots had jumped to $350, but in 1864, the valuation dropped to $200, and many other lots were reduced by half or more in worth. By 1864, a considerable number of parcels were worth only $3. And for many unlikely investors such as G.W. Crowth, P.B. McNeil, and Richard Newell, lots valued at $300 in 1860 and had zero value in 1864. In 1867, Oreapolis' assessment had disappeared and all but a few lots were completely off the tax roll. The physical evidence of Oreapolis also quickly vanished, as if the fleeting settlement of 5 years had never existed. In May of 1865, the Nebraska Herald in Plattsmouth reported that, quote, a large portion of the buildings composing the town of Oreapolis have been moved to Plattsmouth, and what is left will soon travel the same road, end quote. The seminary was built to last. However, in one of the most peculiar occurrences in territorial Nebraska and a stark example of the pitfalls of wildcat speculation, the newly completed 8,000 square foot building was demolished just 3 years after its opening, and its bricks were used in house construction in Plattsmouth. Just 20 years later, it was reported that there was nothing to mark the spot either of an aspiring town or the pretentious seminary. Although Reverend Miller's residence near the seminary site, the Brown House, survived until the 1940s. Omaha's first outlandish growth spurt with lots selling for steeply inflated prices suddenly crashed in the 1857 panic when the unstable banks closed and real estate values and sales plummeted. The gold rush of 1859, however, was an economic miracle for the struggling village. Competing fiercely with Nebraska City, Omaha had 268 steamboat visits in 1859, bringing goods and thousands of immigrants, while shipments of local agricultural produce and buffalo hides to markets down the river also increased dramatically. Its streets were transformed into a frantic 24-hour noisy epicenter of freighters and outfitters equipping crowds of immigrants, while in May of 1860 numbered 100 wagons per day rushing to Colorado via the Mormon Military Road. In these wagons, more than 20 Omaha freighter businesses shipped 713,000 pounds of goods, food, clothing, lumber, and whiskey. In 1860, the combined metro population of Omaha and Council Bluffs was 4,000, making it the largest river settlement north of St. Joseph and a magnet that both new residents and westward immigrants flocked to. With Omaha as a hub, the Western Stage Company provided passenger services to St. Joseph, Sioux City, Dakota, Columbus, Fort Kearny, and in 1860 to Denver. It also linked Omaha to the east, while 3 railroad companies were building tracks west across Iowa directed towards Council Bluffs. Edward Creighton extended the Western Union Telegraph line from St. Joseph to Omaha, then to Fort Kearny in 1860, followed by his remarkable completion of the Pacific Telegraph Company line across the continent the following year. The discovery of gold at Virginia City, Montana in 1863 and the Plains Indian War of 1864 and 65 also dramatically increased freighting from Omaha. Each success built upon success. As early as 1857, Nathan Howe Parker, an author of Midwestern travel books, prophesied that Omaha, quote, has the start of all rivals which no ordinary advantage can overcome, end quote. Unfortunately for John Evans, Omaha's rise to prosperity came at the expense of Oreapolis. Omaha's greatest good fortune, though, perhaps rested upon Abraham Lincoln's chance meeting with Grenville Dodge in August of 1859. Dodge, a young railroad survey engineer and Council Bluffs entrepreneur, recalled the event 52 years later. Quote, Mr. Lincoln heard from someone of my explorations and surveys and that I was in Council Bluffs, and he sought me out on the porch of the Pacific Hotel. For 2 hours, he engaged me in conversation about what I knew of this country west of the Missouri River, and greatly impressed me by his great interest he displayed in the work in which I was engaged. He stated that there was nothing more important before the nation at that time than the building of the railroad to the Pacific coast. He ingeniously extorted a great deal of information from me, and I found the secrets I had been holding on for my employers to the east had been given to him. This interview was the greatest importance to me. It was a milestone in my life, and Mr. Lincoln never forgot it." End quote. The Civil War urgently increased the need for a transcontinental railroad because of California's isolation and the rapid Confederate military expansion in the Southwest. The intense political pressure by Southerners in Congress for a Southern Pacific route disappeared with the onset of war, opening the way for a northern route which ultimately favored Chicago instead of St. Louis. St. Joseph, Missouri was for a time the most likely eastern terminus, but it was deemed too great a security risk because of the riots and continued unrest in Kansas. As a wartime emergency measure, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act on July 1, 1862, creating the Union Pacific Railroad Corporation to construct a railroad from the Missouri River west to join with the Central Pacific Railroad, simultaneously building east from California. It authorized a subsidy of a 20 million acre land grant and a $60 million loan. To head off the controversial decision for an eastern terminus, the line was to begin at the 100th meridian between the Platte and Republican rivers. The president would choose the eastern terminus on the Missouri River at an unidentified location on the western boundary to Iowa. To appease rival towns, branch lines would be built west to converge at the 100th meridian from Kansas City, St. Joseph, Leavenworth, and Sioux City. With the burden of the war, President Lincoln felt the government was unable to build the railroad, but he supported American private enterprise to tackle the job. The plan stalled, however, as capitalist inventors were cautious of the great financial risks and underwhelmed by the land giveaway offered by the government. In June of 1863, President Lincoln summoned Grenville Dodge to the White House to consult about the railroad's route. Dodge, now General Grant's protege and a standout Union officer in tactics and espionage, would soon be promoted as the war's youngest major general. In 1911, he reminisced, quote, "From an engineering point of view, I pointed out clearly to the president where the line should start and what our surveys had determined. He listened and discussed this question with me for a long time. I saw from his talk and his indication that his view coincided with mine, and I have no doubt he made his decision at that time." End quote. Financing the construction remained a huge stumbling block for wary investors. To fill this need, Thomas Durant, a shady railroad capitalist and an Omaha speculator named George Francis Train, created Credit Mobile of America, a phony shadow construction corporation whose officials were the same as those of Union Pacific. Ultimately, this led to one of the largest criminal financial scandals in American history. On December 2, 1863, the Union Pacific office in Omaha received a telegram from Durant in New York that President Lincoln had designated the terminus at the western boundary of the state of Iowa opposite Omaha. Omaha was delirious, and within an hour, officials hastily announced the groundbreaking would take place later that day. 1,000 people turned out for the joyous celebration on the mud flat near the north end of the levee, where cannons were fired from both sides of the Missouri River. The final impromptu orator was George Francis Train, the flamboyantly notorious world traveler who was the theatrical prototype for Phileas Fogg and Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days. He presented a vivid contrast to moralistic John Evans, whose competing Oreapolis had so spectacularly failed. Declaring Omaha as the, quote, central station of the world's highway, end quote, Train bloviated that 10 million of immigrants would settle in this golden land in 20 years. Attracting investment for so large a scheme continued to be a major problem. Durant wanted fewer restrictions and more shares of government land grants. In connection with the powerful Massachusetts Congressman Oakes Ames, who along with his brother Oliver would later become Union Pacific executives, Durant successfully bribed and cajoled various members of Congress to pass an amendment to the railroad law signed by President Lincoln on July 2, 1864, that doubled the land grant and increased stock shares from 100,000 to 1 million. The two acts granted the Union Pacific more than $27 million plus 6,400 acres of public land per mile of track. Omaha was not yet out of the woods, though. In a phony stock scheme to line his pockets, the mercurial Durant unsuccessfully attempted to merge two railroad building rails across Iowa so that it would cross the Missouri considerably north of Omaha, while he further incensed Omaha and Council Bluffs by insisting on an oxbow route south to Bellevue before turning west, creating justifiable panic that he intended to build the railroad station depot, shops, and bridge there. Innumerable hindrances slowed the beginning of construction, which finally began after the end of the war in July of 1865. By the spring of 1866, rail construction had only reached 50 miles west of Omaha, but the pace rapidly accelerated with 200 miles by the end of the year after Grenville Dodge became chief engineer. The company's 6 steamboats and hundreds of wagons from Iowa railheads brought thousands of tons of rails, ties, rolling stock, and equipment to Omaha, transforming it into a mammoth supply depot for which 1 mile of track required 40 carloads of materials. A further huge boon came to Omaha in 1866 when it was selected as the headquarters of the U.S. Army of the Platte, which included its quartermaster depot to supply western forts and troops with goods and munitions from its extensive warehouses. Omaha became the primary military shipping point for the West. The laying of rails continued west at a feverish pace with thousands of workers, and Omaha's boom was unprecedented with millions of dollars attracting new businesses and residents of every kind. Finally, on May 10, 1869, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific construction crews met at Promontory, Utah, for the ceremony of striking the final golden spike. In Omaha, a raucous celebration lasted into evening fireworks. Quote, private and public buildings were ornamented with decorations of all kinds, flags, festoons, banners, and mottos. A telegraph line was run to a building on Capitol Hill, and direct communication was had with Promontory. With the last blow given at Promontory, it was instantly known in Omaha, where 100 guns were fired in rapid succession when the announcement was made, end quote. Omaha's future as a commercial hub was now secure. From an insignificant camp of 24 shacks and log cabins only 15 years before, its population since 1860 had increased 754% to 16,000 and was now positioned for even more explosive growth as it became the hub of many more railroads in the remaining 3 decades of the 19th century. Oreapolis, its brief rival, had vanished with few traces, and Omaha was now unquestionably the dominant city of the upper Missouri River Basin. As Colorado's governor, John Evans' entrepreneurial plans were to achieve statehood and build a railroad to Denver to export mineral wealth to the east, while bringing white settlers to Colorado to develop its resources and economy. Although he was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for Colorado, he was indifferent to and lacked sympathy for the protection of Indians under his charge. Rather, his political aims were contrary to their welfare. Along with the large majority of Colorado settlers and most white Americans of the era, Evans considered Indians to be an inferior race and unflailingly believed their vast lands should be rightfully developed by white Americans according to the popular creed of Manifest Destiny. He patronizingly advocated for them to be civilized and follow the white man's ways to become farmers. As a result of increasing clashes with Indians, in 1864, Evans appointed Reverend John Shivington, formerly Nebraska City's strident Free Soil Methodist minister, to be commander of the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, and hastily assembled poorly trained volunteer regiment recruited for 100 days. The two men had probably become acquainted in Omaha in 1859 and the Kansas-Nebraska Methodist Conference, where both served on the Education Committee and advocated for the Oreapolis University, Seminary, and Biblical Institute. In 1860, Reverend Shivington was appointed as the Methodist presiding elder of the newly formed Rocky Mountain District. He was followed by Reverend William Good, then agent for the Oreapolis Seminary, when he received a call to minister to the Colorado mining camps. This fateful alliance of Evans and Shivington led to the November 1864 massacre in eastern Colorado of peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho supposedly under the protection of the U.S. Army. The Sand Creek Massacre, as it soon became known, remains one of America's most shameful tragedies. Although Evans at the time was in Washington, D.C. lobbying for Colorado statehood, his bungling of Indian affairs and the connection with Chivington, fueled by the sharp national outrage against the atrocity against women and children, led to 3 official investigations and his forced resignation as Colorado governor by U.S. Secretary of State William Seward. This ended Evans' quest to become a U.S. senator and was a factor in delaying Colorado's statehood for 10 years. In the 1860s, Denver was a small, isolated village, lacking a natural east-west railroad route through the mountains. Its initial mining boom and growth had stalled, and it was in danger of becoming another insignificant, dusty western town, perhaps even losing its territorial capital status. However, John Evans' actions as governor were applauded in Colorado, and he remained popular as the Sand Creek Massacre controversy receded. With intrepid zeal, Evans devoted the remaining 40 years of his life to restlessly promoting Denver's development. Wily and astute, he schemed, cajoled, and bullied to assure that Denver would become the primary Western transportation hub. He aggressively jousted with other Gilded Age potentates of capital and railroad barons of the same day. Oakes and Oliver Ames, Jay Gould, Thomas Durant, William Jackson Palmer, and W.A.H. Loveland. Grenville Dodge had dismissed both of Evans' proposals of the Berthold Pass or South Park route west of Denver from the main line of the Union Pacific Railroad through the Rocky Mountains. However, due to Evans' diligence, the city rejoiced in 1870 with the completion of both the Kansas Pacific Railroad from Kansas City and the Denver and Pacific Railroad link to the main Union Pacific line at Cheyenne, Wyoming. Coupled with his sharp acumen in real estate investments, Evans nimbly advanced railroad expansion into western Colorado, into Texas, and the Gulf of Mexico to provide Denver with a seaport access, and he later schemed for railroads from Denver to Duluth in the Black Hills. Evans had not forgotten his cherished Oreapolis proposal to establish a great Western university. His venture to create the Colorado Seminary was unsuccessful, as was his 1874 plan for the Union Evangelical University to be supported by Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, and Baptist churches. But in 1880, the University of Denver, another Methodist institution, opened with Evans as president of the board. He remained closely connected to its affairs, as he did with Northwestern University in Evanston and with the National Methodist activities until his death in 1897. He was also a guiding force in charitable and civic improvements in Denver, such as promoting park development and incorporating the State Historical Society of Colorado. More than any single person in the 19th century, Evans' efforts to champion Denver's growth was responsible for it becoming the largest and most influential metropolis of the Intermountain West. In his adopted city, Evans ultimately created the city that he had once intended 20 years before for Oreapolis. There were numerous reasons for the failure of John Evans' grand scheme. By 1861, it had become apparent that Oreapolis could never overcome the advantages of Nebraska City, and especially Omaha, in population, commerce, and the likely site of the Pacific Railroad eastern terminus. Ironically, even though Oreapolis was created as a transportation hub, it was in a geographic cul-de-sac without bridges, hemmed in by the Missouri and Platte Rivers to the east and north, and the growth of Plattsmouth to the south. There was no established direct road across Iowa that ended at the Missouri River opposite the new settlement. As the United States descended into war, growth and momentum halted when money became scarce, and the Burlington and Missouri Railroad buildings across Iowa did not arrive to Plattsmouth until 1870. Evans himself speculated in 1888 that failure lay with the Burlington Railroad that was, quote, so long in building, end quote, and in hindsight, even admitted that Oreapolis was too close to Plattsmouth. One historian has noted that in a frontier economy with only land-poor local boosters, the lack of wealthy benefactors to establish an endowment for the Oreapolis Seminary and the university was also a critical factor in their failure. Ultimately, the fate of Oreapolis rested on timing. Evans might have succeeded if he had aggressively spearheaded his city at the beginning of the Nebraska Territory in 1854 rather than in 1859, and if he had moved to Oreapolis to promote his investment instead of only visiting infrequently. The 5-year jumpstart development of the other competitive Missouri River towns and their on-the-ground political wrangling, of which Evans was largely absent, were decisive in their furious, cutthroat battle for dominance. Oreapolis was the largest failed speculative town venture in territorial Nebraska, but neither it nor its proposed university were unusual either in Nebraska or the Midwest and Great Plains. The Nebraska frontier was populated by numerous shady conmen promoting spurless real estate schemes fueled by wildcat banks without assets. In the first years open to settlement, especially before the financial panic of 1857, the land speculation was a bane to struggling new residents attempting to protect their preemption claims. Cass County is a prime case study of the frenzied schemes of grifters and profiteers promoting get-rich-quick paper towns. In 1857 alone, 27 towns were chartered, a year after the county was first surveyed. A surprising total of 64 towns, most of them imaginary paper ghost towns, were eventually laid out in the county, including Capital City, Cleveland, El Dorado, Grenada, Oreapolis, Marseille, Ravenna, and Troy. Brooklyn was platted with a single east-west street on a narrow island in the Platte River. Likewise, an excessive number of private schools were chartered in Nebraska. Between 1854 and statehood in 1867, the territorial legislature absurdly received charter proposals for 31 educational institutions, including 10 universities, 7 colleges, 5 collegiate institutes, 7 seminaries, an academy, and a biblical institute. Most of these were booster schemes that never opened, such as Western University in Cass County, chartered in 1857 for the paper town of Mount Pleasant, 3 miles north of present-day Nahaka. One of the most enjoyable aspects of armchair history is to speculate on causation. Quote, what might have been, end quote, if certain incidents of the past had played out differently. It is tantalizing to wonder if Abraham Lincoln had appointed John Evans instead of Alvin Saunders as the governor of the Nebraska Territory in 1861, would this have set the stage for a different chain of events in the history of Nebraska and the West? In 1862, would John Evans' connection with President Lincoln and his powerful political and financial influence have thrown the decision to Oreapolis or Plattsmouth as the eastern terminus of the Union Pacific Railroad, leaving Omaha behind to become just another sleepy Missouri River town? Even if he had not prevailed in his primary goal, if Evans had remained in Nebraska, would Oreapolis have eventually thrived as a university suburb of Omaha, like Evanston's relationship with Chicago? And would his university have become the premier academic center of the Midlands? Likewise, would Evans' dominant presence as governor have persuaded the hyper-partisan territorial legislature, determined to remove the capital south of the Platte River as statehood, to favor Oreapolis instead of the barely existent Lancaster, now Lincoln? Would Evans have devoted his entire life to single-mindedly promoting Nebraska and Oreapolis, as he did later with Colorado and Denver? And would his continued Nebraska residence have therefore prevented the catastrophe of his Colorado governorship in the history-changing Sand Creek Massacre, which contributed to bitter warfare for the next 15 years between Plains Indians and the U.S. Army? John Evans' visionary city emanated from a conjunction of his audacious ideas and unquenchable ambition. In an alternative universe, one can imagine the spires and towers of a city vast just south of the Platte River, the large metropolis of the Intermountain West, well known for its respected research university, with Plattsmouth and Bellevue its historic suburbs. Instead, in the present day, this once conceived urban center is now a crossroads of a different sort, a junction of several transportation routes. The north-south, east-west BNSFR railroad tracks intersect with the 4-lane north-south Highway 75 freeway overpass. It is the site of the Four Lakes Preserve, with homes adjacent to small recreational lakes repurposed from former sand and gravel pits. An active quarry dredge works a pit with a boom to the shore. Some of the land is part of the Randall W. Schilling Wildlife Management Area, an important biodiverse wetland that extends along the Missouri River north of Plattsmouth, while nearby are traditional agricultural fields. Even its forgotten name, given to a local limestone geological formation in 1915, is today a defunct scientific nomenclature. Now, only a lonely railroad marker and a sign for a road that fittingly dead ends before reaching the Missouri River bears the name of the vanishing dream of long ago, Oreapolis. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.